At the reading of Aunt Margaret's will, I discovered something that would permanently change how certain people in my life looked at me and how I looked at them. I had expected that day to be quiet and somewhat bittersweet, a formality after the loss of a woman I had admired deeply but who, in practical terms, had been a fairly modest presence in my life. I thought I would sit in a tidy office, sign a condolence book, maybe receive some small keepsake. A brooch, a book from her shelves, a framed photograph. Instead, as the lawyer's words began to unfold in the still air, I realized the story of my life had just taken a turn no one in the room was prepared for. Ms. Carter, the lawyer, was a precise woman in her late 50s, with square glasses and a tone that made every sentence sound as if it had been carefully measured before it left her lips. She began reading through the usual formalities, her voice steady over the gentle hum of the air conditioner, until she reached my name. She paused, glanced briefly up from the page, and then read, "To my niece, Emily Hart, I leave the sum of $750,000 to be held in trust in her name." There was a beat of absolute silence, just long enough for me to register the weight of the words. Before the atmosphere in the room shifted so palpably that it felt like the floor itself tilted. Every head turned toward me. My mother's hands, folded neatly in her lap a moment earlier, tightened slightly. My Uncle Martin leaned forward by an almost imperceptible inch, as though proximity alone could bring him closer to whatever had just landed in my life. My cousin Jason's eyes moved to the thick folder on the table, flickering with an interest he wasn't quick enough to hide. Before that sentence, I had been Emily Hart, 29 years old, a public school English teacher earning enough to pay rent on a small upstairs flat, feed myself, and occasionally replace the shoes that wore thin too quickly on my walk to work. My life was modest, predictable, and in many ways, invisible to the people sitting in that room. After that sentence, I was something entirely different in their eyes. A person in possession of a sum large enough to redraw their mental maps of what I was worth. If you enjoy stories where kindness is tested, where polite smiles mask sharper intentions, and where the quietest person in the room turns out to be the one no one should underestimate, make sure you subscribe right now. I share stories like this every single day, and you won't want to miss the way this one unfolds from the first surprise to the last twist. I wanted to feel joy, or at least relief. I thought that hearing I had inherited such an amount would immediately loosen the knot of constant calculations in my head, the weekly balancing act of bills and groceries, the quiet dread of a dental emergency, the hesitation before saying yes to dinner with friends because it meant cutting something else. But what I felt first was heat, rising from my neck into my face, as if someone had turned a spotlight directly on me. "Ms. Carter's voice moved on, reading through the conditions of the trust, the clauses that protected it, but I could feel the weight of the stairs as acutely as if they were hands pressing on my shoulders. Aunt Margaret had always been a quiet but constant presence in my life. She was my father's older sister, a widow without children who lived in a modest brick house 2 bus stops away from the one I grew up in. She didn't buy lavish gifts, but she gave me things I treasured. Second-hand novels wrapped in brown paper, with sentences underlined and her looping notes in the margins, for when life tries to make you small. She showed up for the important things, my school plays, my graduation, and also for the quieter moments, like the rainy afternoons when I hid in the library to escape the noise of home. She was not, in my memory, a woman of wealth. Yet here she was, in absence, making a statement of extraordinary generosity that would ripple through the family in ways I had not yet begun to grasp. My mother was the first to break the silence. "Well," she said, her lips curving into a smile that stopped just short of her eyes, "that's generous." There was an edge beneath her voice, the kind that could be mistaken for surprise if you weren't paying attention, but I knew my mother's tones well enough to hear the calculation already forming beneath her polite words. Uncle Martin followed with his contribution, spoken in the deliberate way he used when he wanted his opinion to seem like guidance rather than instruction. "Something like that should be steward," he said, "managed with the family in mind." Martin had built a career in investments, forever describing money as though it were a living thing that needed the right habitat to grow. Then Jason chimed in. At 32, he was the kind of man who could make you feel like you'd known him for years in 5 minutes, but who had a habit of leaving small messes behind, borrowing things he didn't return quite the same, floating from one freelance project to another. And he said warmly, "If you want something safe, I've got this opportunity I've been vetting. Family discount." I took the pen Ms. Carter handed me because in moments like that, you don't leave a pen waiting. You sign where the sticky tabs tell you to sign, you initial where the paper commands, and you keep your expression as calm as possible even while your heart beats in your throat. On the ride home, the first wave of attention began. My phone lit up over and over. Texts from my mother about meeting to discuss next steps, a link from Uncle Martin to a portfolio management firm owned by an old friend, a voice note from Jason delivered in a tone that pretended not to care. No pressure. But we should chat. I can show you projections. I turned my phone face down and watched the city blur past the train window. I tried to remember the last time any of them had called me simply to ask how I was doing, without an agenda. I couldn't. That night, I went to Grace. She's been my closest friend since university. A nurse who handles emergencies with quick hands and stubborn calm, but who also knows when to say nothing and just make tea. She opened her door, took one look at me, and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost who owes you money." I told her everything, from the lawyer's pause before reading my name to the way the air in the room seemed to thicken after. She didn't ask for details about the money, didn't joke about trips or shopping sprees. She just listened, then said, "You're allowed to feel grateful and cautious at the same time. Money doesn't change what people value. It shows you what they were already willing to do for it." Over the next several days, the change in tone for my family was both subtle and relentless. My mother spoke about the optics of keeping so much when family has needs. When I asked what she meant, she mentioned Jason's hope of buying a flat, Martin's contributions to the family over the years, and her own leaky roof. I reminded her Aunt Margaret had already left her money specifically for the house repairs. "That's different," she said. "Yours is extra. It would be nice to show we share." Uncle Martin invited me to lunch at a bistro that tried too hard to look casual. Between the burrata and the bill, he talked about legacy and safe but aggressive investments, phrases that sounded contradictory but rolled off his tongue as though they were common sense. Jason called late at night, his voice dropping as though we were planning a heist together, talking about trial runs and family-led initiatives. Then, 4 days after the will reading, Ms. Carter called to confirm the trust was established and to remind me to secure all communications. She added something that stayed with me. "If anyone mentions a family trust addendum, be especially cautious. People misuse those terms." That evening, Jason texted me a link to a document. "Just preliminary," he wrote. "A simple addendum so we're all aligned. You can e-sign, saves time tomorrow." The document authorized a small, temporary transfer into an investment managed by a company I'd never heard of, whose website was a wall of stock photos of people laughing at laptops. I sent it to Ms. Carter. She replied within minutes, "Do not." 2 days later, my mother sent an agenda for a family meeting at her house. It read like a corporate memo: define Emily's short-term needs, explore long-term investment opportunities, discuss family priorities, and equitable distribution. That last phrase rang louder than the rest. On Sunday, I walked into the scent of lemon polish and something sweet baking. My mother poured tea into matching cups. Martin had his folder. Jason wore his trust me smile. "We just want to protect you from your own generosity," my mother began. "It's easy to be taken advantage of." She slid an envelope toward me. Inside was the same document Jason had sent. Only now my mother's and Martin's signatures were at the bottom, as if they'd witnessed a conversation we'd never had. I looked at them one by one, keeping my voice even. "I appreciate the thought, but I won't sign anything without Ms. Carter reviewing it." My mother's smile tightened. Martin leaned back, his fingers tapping once against the table. Jason glanced down at the document, then back at me. "We only want what's best," my mother said. "I know," I replied. "So, do I." I slipped the envelope into my bag. We finished our tea, discussing the weather, as if we hadn't just confirmed the real reason we were there. That night, I pulled out a book Aunt Margaret had given me when I was 13. Inside the cover, in her looping handwriting, was the line I'd read countless times. For Emily, who will one day learn that being good does not mean being quiet. I read it again. Then I began to make plans. I didn't sleep much after the so-called family meeting. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter all night, like it had weight beyond the few pieces of paper inside it. I kept imagining my mother, my uncle, and Jason huddled around a table before Sunday, rehearsing how they'd present it, deciding who would speak first, who would play good cop. I knew enough about all three of them to picture exactly how that conversation had gone. By Monday morning, my phone had already accumulated a small library of messages from them. Jason sent a just checking in text that was immediately followed by a meme about teamwork, as if that could disguise the fact that he wanted to siphon money through me. My mother left a voicemail asking if I'd had a chance to reflect. Uncle Martin's email was short and tidy. The sooner we act, the sooner your future is secure. The phrase, "your future is secure," stuck with me. Not because I believed it, but because it said so much about how they thought this would work. In their minds, my future wasn't mine to shape. It was theirs to manage, to mold into something that fit their comfort zones, something that paid off for them. I needed to be careful now. They thought they were dealing with someone soft, someone easy to corner. That assumption was the only advantage I had, and I intended to use it. The first thing I did was call Miss Carter. She listened without interrupting while I explained the meeting, the signatures already printed at the bottom of the document, and my suspicion that this wasn't going to stop anytime soon. "You're correct," she said simply. "It won't. You need to assume they're already discussing their next attempt. They've shown you they're willing to put pressure on you as a group, and the fact that they've introduced documents without your consent is a red flag. If you don't want them anywhere near your inheritance, you have to make that boundary legally airtight." She walked me through the steps, tightening the trust terms, locking down the account to require her sign-off for any movement of funds, and placing all correspondence related to the estate in a secure client portal. "And Emily," she added, her tone shifting slightly, "do not discuss the specifics of the money with them again. Let them guess. Let them assume. But don't confirm anything. The less they know, the less they can try to manipulate." It was good advice, but it also planted the seed of something else. I didn't just want to protect the money. I wanted to turn the tables. That week, I tested the waters. I responded to my mother's texts with vague reassurances. "I'm thinking about your suggestions, Mum." I replied to Jason's voice notes with airy, non-committal phrases. "That's interesting. I'll look into it." When Martin called to mention a time-sensitive opportunity, I told him I'd need a few days to get my documents in order. I could practically hear the satisfaction in his voice, as if he thought I was finally falling into line. Meanwhile, I was collecting information. Grace helped me look into Jason's opportunity and found out the company he mentioned wasn't just unregistered. It didn't exist beyond a glossy website and a P.O. box. Uncle Martin's safe but aggressive investment fund had been fined last year for misleading clients. My mother, for all her talk about fairness, had quietly taken out a personal loan the month before Aunt Margaret died, and according to public records, she was already months behind on payments. It wasn't just about greed. It was about desperation wrapped in self-righteousness. On Thursday, I got the call that confirmed my decision. My mother rang me at work, something she never does unless it's serious. "I've been thinking," she began without preamble, "about how to make sure you don't get overwhelmed with all of this. It's a lot for one person. Maybe it would be better if you put the money into a shared account for now, so you don't feel burdened." I almost laughed. Burdened wasn't the word she meant. She meant out of reach. I ended the call politely, but the moment I hung up, the plan began to take shape in full. If they wanted to be part of my financial journey, I would give them an event so significant they couldn't resist showing up, and then I would use it to make my position crystal clear. The opportunity came in the form of a letter from the Children's Hospital 2 neighborhoods over. Grace had been fundraising for them for years, and they were holding a donor appreciation dinner in 2 weeks. Large contributions could be announced publicly at the event if the donor wished. I called MS Carter to confirm that a donation from the trust could be made in Aunt Margaret's name, and within days, the arrangements were in motion. I didn't tell my family the specifics. I simply invited them all to what I described as a dinner to discuss the future of Aunt Margaret's legacy. I knew those words would work on them, half genuine sentiment, half fate. Within hours, I had confirmation from all three. The following week was a strange balancing act. They kept reaching out, pressing for details, and I kept them hooked with just enough information to keep their hopes alive. Jason offered to help prepare the presentation, assuming there would be one. Martin sent me a list of discussion points about diversification and liquidity. My mother reminded me that public perception mattered and hinted she might say a few words if I wanted her to. I smiled through it all, even as my stomach tightened every time my phone buzzed. Grace knew everything, of course, and she kept me steady. "Remember," she said, "you're not just reacting anymore. You're leading this now." 2 nights before the dinner, Jason showed up at my flat unannounced. He leaned against the doorframe like we were just old friends catching up, but I could see the tension in his jaw. I just want to make sure we're aligned before Sunday," he said. "It'd be a shame if we wasted an opportunity, because we weren't on the same page." I let him talk for a while about how money loses value if it just sits there, about how family businesses could be the key to turning Margaret's gift into something 10 times bigger. Then I asked as casually as I could, "And what would my role be in this?" He grinned. "Silent partner. You put in the capital. We handle the rest." I nodded, pretending to think it over, and then promised we'd discuss it Sunday. The relief in his face was almost comical. Sunday arrived crisp and clear. I wore the deep green dress Aunt Margaret had given me years ago, the one she'd said made me look like I knew exactly where I was going. The dinner was held in the hospital's event hall, beautifully set with white linens and warm lighting. My family arrived expecting, I'm sure, to sit through a few polite speeches before I handed them some version of control over my inheritance. Instead, I greeted them warmly, thanked them for coming, and guided them to our table near the front. Grace was there too, her presence like a steady anchor. Ms. Carter had also agreed to attend, her idea, in fact, sitting quietly at the end of the table with a small folder in front of her. As the evening unfolded, the speeches began. Doctors talked about the work the hospital was doing, the children they'd helped, the programs they were hoping to expand. I saw my mother's polite expression start to turn puzzled. Jason kept glancing at me. Martin's fingers drummed a slow rhythm on the tablecloth. Then the master of ceremonies took the stage and began announcing the night's major donations. And finally, he said, smiling toward our table, "We'd like to thank Emily Hart, who has made a substantial contribution in honor of her late aunt, Margaret Hart. Thanks to Emily's generosity, the hospital will be opening a new children's reading room, furnished and stocked entirely by her gift." The applause was warm, genuine, and loud. I felt it wash over me, not as a performance, but as a moment Aunt Margaret would have loved. I glanced at my family. My mother's mouth was slightly open. Jason was frozen mid-clap. Martin's face had gone completely still. When the applause faded, I stood. "Thank you," I said into the microphone. Aunt Margaret believed in giving to those who truly needed it. I wanted her legacy to reflect that. This donation is just the beginning. I've placed the rest of the funds in a trust that will be used for causes she cared about. That trust is protected, and it cannot be altered by anyone but me and my trustee. I smiled then, the kind of smile that feels like a full stop at the end of a sentence. I'm grateful to everyone who supports this decision. I sat down to the sound of polite clapping from strangers and absolute silence from my family. The moment I sat back down at the donor dinner table, I could feel the shift in the air. Not the warm gratitude from the hospital staff or the quiet hum of conversation around us, but the heavy silence coming from 3 people who had walked into this room expecting one thing and were now trying to process the fact that they had gotten something entirely different. My mother was the first to speak, though she didn't look directly at me. "That was unexpected," she said finally, her voice low enough that only our table could hear. The way she pressed her napkin between her fingers made me think she was trying to keep herself from saying more. Jason gave a short laugh that was far too loud for the context. "Generous," he said, leaning back in his chair as though casualness could cover how tight his jaw had become. "Really generous. But all of it? I mean, we could have—" Martin interrupted him, his tone softer but edged with something sharper. "It's your decision, of course," he said. "But you've essentially locked away the majority of your inheritance in a way that can't adapt to changing circumstances. That's not always wise." I took a sip of water before answering, not because I needed the pause, but because I wanted them to feel it. "Actually, it's more flexible than you think. The trust is set up so I can make donations at my discretion to causes that align with Aunt Margaret's values. She loved books, education, and helping children. I think she'd be pleased." Grace shifted slightly beside me, her hand brushing mine under the table in silent support. "Yes." Carter, seated at the far end, caught my eye and gave the smallest of nods. The rest of the dinner passed with polite small talk. My mother made a few attempts to steer the conversation toward my plans for the future, but I deflected each one with a smile and a vague comment about needing to think things over. Jason barely touched his food. Martin kept his expression neutral, but every so often, his eyes would flick to me as though recalculating something in his head. When the evening ended, the three of them walked out together, their faces a mixture of forced cordiality and unfinished business. Grace stayed with me until the last guests had gone. "They're not done," she said quietly. "I know," I replied, "but neither am I." The following week confirmed it. My mother called me on Tuesday, her tone light, but her words carefully chosen. "I just don't want you to regret making such a big commitment so soon," she said. "Sometimes, when you sit with a decision, you realize you could have done it differently." Jason, for his part, sent me an email with the subject line "Second Chance." Inside was a link to a revised proposal for his non-existent investment company, this time framed as a community venture that could work alongside charitable giving. Martin was more direct. He invited me to his office, poured 2 glasses of something amber into short tumblers, and laid out a spreadsheet that looked like it had been prepared for a board meeting. "You can still keep the trust in place," he said, "but if you allocate a portion to a private investment portfolio, you could triple the value in a few years and donate even more later. It's not about taking money away from charity, it's about being smarter with it." I looked at the neat columns of numbers, all the while thinking about how none of their sudden concern, their offers, their advice, had existed before Aunt Margaret's will was read. "I'll think about it," I told him, then stood before he could press further. What they didn't know was that my next move was already in motion. The hospital had invited me to visit the site where the new children's reading room would be built. It was still an empty space then. Freshly painted walls, bright new windows, and the faint scent of sawdust. As I walked through it with the head librarian, she told me how the room would be filled with shelves of books, beanbag chairs, and little reading nooks. "We'll have a plaque on the wall with your aunt's name," she said. "It'll be here for decades." That, I realized, was the core of my revenge. Not humiliating my family or cutting them off with a sharp gesture, but making sure that every time they thought about my inheritance, they would picture it here, transformed into something they couldn't control, something that would outlast all of us. I decided to seal it in a way they couldn't ignore. 2 weeks later, I invited them all to my flat for dinner. "Nothing formal," I'd said on the phone. "Just us. I thought it'd be nice to catch up." I made lasagna, poured wine, and kept the atmosphere warm enough that they didn't suspect anything until after dessert. That's when I brought out the envelope. Not their envelope, theirs was still in my desk drawer, but a new one. I placed it in the center of the table and slid it toward my mother. "I wanted you all to have this," I said. She hesitated before opening it, her eyes narrowing slightly. Inside were 3 glossy photographs of the reading room construction, each one with a caption explaining what part of the donation had paid for the shelving, the lighting, the initial book collection. In the last photo, propped against the freshly painted wall, was the plaque, "In memory of Margaret Hart, whose love of stories lives on." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Jason gave a short, dry laugh. Martin simply stared at the pictures for a long moment before setting them down. I continued, my voice calm. You might like to see where Aunt Margaret's legacy is going. Every child who walks into that room will know her name. That's more valuable to me than any return on investment could be. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mother said, "It's a beautiful gesture, Emily. I just wish you'd involved us in the decision." "I did," I replied. "I invited you to the dinner." Jason pushed his chair back, muttering something about an early meeting the next day. Martin followed suit, pausing only to say, "If you ever change your mind, my door's open." After they left, I sat at the table with my empty wine glass, feeling the strange blend of exhaustion and relief that comes after you've stood your ground. Grace arrived a little later, and I showed her the photos. "They didn't see it coming, did they?" she asked. "Not even close," I said. Over the next month, the calls and messages from my family dwindled. There were still occasional attempts. An article my mother sent me about smart philanthropy, a voicemail from Jason suggesting we start fresh, a forwarded email from Martin about an investment seminar, but each one was easier to ignore. They weren't gone. Not entirely, but the constant pressure had broken. The reading room opened 6 months later. On the day of the ribbon cutting, the space was filled with the sound of children's voices, the rustle of turning pages, and the warm light streaming through the windows. I stood beside the plaque, running my fingers over the engraved letters of Aunt Margaret's name, and felt something settle inside me. I didn't invite my family to the opening. Some acts are better witnessed by those who understand them, and this wasn't for the ones who'd seen the money as a means to their own ends. This was for Aunt Margaret, for every child who would curl up in a beanbag and discover a story that made their world bigger, and for the part of me that had learned, finally. That being good doesn't mean being quiet. In the weeks that followed, I heard from Grace that Jason had been telling people I'd tied up the money so no one could touch it. My mother had mentioned to a neighbor that she didn't agree with how things were handled. Martin had apparently moved on to other ventures. And that was fine. Let them talk. Every time they did, they kept the memory of that night alive. Not the way they wanted, but the way I wanted. One Saturday afternoon, I stopped by the reading room unannounced. A little girl was sitting cross-legged in one of the nooks, her hair falling forward as she bent over a book twice the size of her head. On the wall above her, Aunt Margaret's name caught the light. That was when I realized the real victory wasn't in outsmarting my family. It was in building something they could never dismantle, something they would have to live with knowing they had no part in. And that's why, if you've been listening to this story and thinking about the people in your own life who only show up when there's something to take, I want you to remember this. You don't have to fight them on their terms. You can choose your own battleground, and you can win in a way that leaves them with nothing but the echo of what they thought they'd gain. So, if you want more stories like this, where greed meets its match, where the underestimated one holds the real power, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because there's always another story, another twist, and another moment where someone learns the hard way that you can't take from a person who refuses to hand over the pen that writes their ending.